Welcome to the Evolving Performance Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to share practical insights to maximize sport performance, durability, training adaptation, and career longevity. I'm your host, Kevin Neild. Today I'm excited to welcome Maria Mountain to the podcast. Maria is a strength and conditioning coach and exercise physiologist with extensive experience working with hockey players across all levels. In 2012, she started goalietrainingpro.com, a business whose mission is to help goalies at all levels play to their potential. Her focus on goalie development has led to her presenting to goalies and coaches from the NHL, Slovakia Hockey Club, Czech Hockey, the Swedish Hockey Association, and last but certainly not least, USA Hockey, among others. Recently, she was an invited guest speaker at our NHL meetings where she gave a terrific presentation discussing goalie-specific training to the performance coaches working in professional hockey. In this episode, we'll discuss what makes the goalie position unique from forwards and defensemen and the implication this has for off-ice training, why certain methods lead to goalies over-pushing and getting out of position, and specific strategies to fix the issue, the role of strength training for goalies, and important information for goalies who don't want to get too quote-unquote bulky, differences in the conditioning demands of practices and games for goalies, and how coaches can alter drills to improve their goalies' development, and key considerations for avoiding hip injuries and maximizing durability throughout the season. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank our first sponsor on the show, Metabolic Elite. Metabolic Elite is a supplement and performance education company founded by James Laval, who is an internationally recognized clinical pharmacist and board-certified clinical nutritionist. Their entire line is designed to specifically support the health, performance, and recovery of high performers. Each product is formulated using research-supported ingredients and dosages using the highest quality ingredients, so you can be confident that every product you take will deliver the maximal benefit and effect. I've personally been taking Metabolic Elite supplements for the last several months, and one of the cool things about the line is that many of the products are made using a liposomal tablet delivery system, which is essentially just a chewable tablet. This LPT technology significantly improves the bioavailability of the supplement, or how much of the product is actually available for your body to use, but the chewable tablets are also easier to take for people that don't like swallowing pills. On a personal note, the two Synapsin products have been an absolute game changer for me. With a work and travel schedule that frequently requires both late nights and early mornings, I've never taken anything that's made me feel as mentally sharp as Synapsin. There's a lot of great information about Synapsin and the other products, the LPT technology, and other important tips to help you optimize your performance on the website. So go check out metabolicelite.co, that's metabolicelite.co, and you can save 15% off all products using the code NEILD15, that's NEELD 15 to save 15%. Now please welcome Maria Mountain. Cool. Maria, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Kev.
So, when you and I first connected years ago, you were helping a lot of hockey players, both in person and then through your online programs as well. But it's been the last several years that you've really focused all of your attention on hockey goalies. So, I think there's always this debate about whether goalies need their own programs or if they should just do what other players do. And, to help create a backdrop for the rest of this conversation, can you talk about what makes the goalie position unique compared to forwards and defensemen?
Well, it's a lot. I look at it as they're playing a completely different sport in terms of their movement profiles and their energy system use. But I think it is the very small space that they have to work within. It's the repeat sprinter part of it, and we don't know how long the race is. So it's a skater, yeah, they might be out there at the end of the game for 2 minutes on a power play or something. For the most part, the shift is sort of within these parameters, but the goalie, we don't know how long each sprint is going to be. Obviously, the stress and the strain of playing that position, there's there's so many elements that make it different.
Kind of along those same lines, when forwards and defensemen talk about their off-ice training goals, you often hear things like, I need to improve my first step quickness, or, I need to get stronger to win battles, or, I'm kind of falling off at the end of games. I need to improve my conditioning. What are some of the most common goals that you hear from goalies and things that they're looking to address in their off-season training?
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of shiny objects in the goalie world. So I will talk to goalies, say, well, I need to become a better puck handler, which I wholeheartedly endorse. I think of a goaltender as an athlete who is a hockey player who plays goal. And I think the role of puck handling as for a goalie is going to get more and more like a I don't follow the NFL that closely, but are there any quarterbacks in the NFL that don't run? It's a key element, and I think puck handling will be the same for goalies. But when I ask them, what are you doing for your puck handling? Well, I shoot 100 pucks a day. Okay, so you don't want to do puck handling. You want to score a goalie goal, which it's like happens what 2 or 3 times, twice a season, maybe once a season. So they get these shiny objects. So that's one. So we have to kind of redirect them to actual puck handling. The other one is I need to improve my hip mobility. Yes, you do. What area? What do you feel on the ice? Well, I want to be able to do the splits. Oh, again, it's okay. Redirecting them, and I've changed my thinking on that a little bit, but acknowledge that not everybody's hips can do the splits. So yes, we want to maximize your mobility, so flexibility plus control. But our goal isn't to just have you kicking out. If you're doing a split save, you've done something really wrong. And, not that you don't need that tool. And then I think the other one is speed and, that quickness on the ice, especially if it's a little bit of a smaller goalie. They need to be a lot faster because they can't just take up as much ice with their net with their body.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that really jump out there. I think the idea of, especially in a world where everybody's on social media and you're seeing, my 7-year-old son will find these series of videos on YouTube in every sport where they're just doing trick shots, and he's just completely enamored with that spectacle. And I think a lot of players see those things, and then that becomes how they're spending a lot of their practice time instead of focusing more effort on some of the big rocks that are going to have a more profound impact on their performance. The speed thing with goalies is interesting because, as you mentioned before, they operate in such a confined space relative to the other players on the ice. I several years ago I worked with the Division 1 goalie that had a really good summer of training with us, and when he started to skate more at the end of the summer, I remember, he came back into the gym and I just said like, "Hey, how are things going?" And he had made the comment that he felt like he was so much more powerful in his lower body that he was actually pushing past the positions he needed to be on the ice. And when I got done patting myself on the back for how powerful he felt, I realized that there was probably a lesson to be learned in that feedback, that a lot of the lateral bounds, diagonal bounds, a lot of these jumping patterns that are certainly common in the programs of hockey players, really at all ages. There may be some unique considerations for goalies that I was overlooking certainly then. And there was a recalibration process for the goalie, and then he pieced it back together with a little bit more on ice work. But I remember talking to you about that situation, and you had some really good suggestions on things that you were starting to incorporate from more of a speed and power development standpoint. So can you enlighten us on what some of those things were, if you remember
Yeah,
back to the
yeah, for
conversation?
sure. Yeah, I'll do my best, but that's normal. Like the goalies that I work with experience that too, especially if they take that break and maybe they don't skate until July. And now we've done all this work, and so it is a recalibration process. But I always just give them a heads up. Hey, for the first maybe 3 skates, you're going to be blowing way out of your crease, and then so when I started, I was the same. I was always, in early videos, big, powerful pushes, and then I started about 10 years ago now, I started playing on the ice myself so that, so I could transfer my very successful road hockey goalie career to the ice as an adult. So I could learn, okay, what's that one muscle that gets exhausted that I never thought of, or what's, something that's much harder than it looks. And so that's when I learned that, okay, I learned to play as an adult. When I do a big powerful push, I blow 7 feet, 8 feet out of my crease. These goalies who've grown up skating and obviously stronger, more powerful than me. Yes, we need that. Like sometimes you just need that big desperation push. We're starting thinking more about grading these pushes, and it kind of goes into something, and I was having a discussion at a camp that I was at. More and more goalie coaches are wanting their goalies to have a narrower stance. And sometimes when you ask, well, why is that? The answer is, well, because they're not powerful when they're in a wide stance. And the reason they're not powerful is because it's never trained. And you don't need a big push. So I think of that that 1 inch punch. They talk about Bruce Lee. He was so powerful he could knock someone over with a 1 inch punch. And so we train more of that in the goalies, having, and having sort of doses. So I have my light push, my medium push, and my hard push. And then the stance is going to depend on the situation. So yes, sometimes you want to have a narrower, more relaxed stance when the puck's outside, but as it comes in, you still want to have that power in close. And then the other thing is that we never used to train is bottom up strength and bottom up power. And so again, I learned that when I started the ice, like, wow, getting up from the butterfly is a lot harder than coming, like doing a squat. So a squat or a split squat, we start at the top, we go down, we come back up. It's very different from starting at the bottom in a standstill and then coming up, both strength and power. So that's another one we work on, from a stance, outer range pushes, different varying degrees from butterfly or from like a kneeling position, different degrees of push.
Yeah, so you hit on a couple of things that I want to circle back to. One is the actual the angle between the foot and the hip that the goalies are pushing from. So, that narrow stance, the feet are a little bit closer to underneath the shoulders, or the wider stance, the feet are typically outside the shoulders, which creates not just a different pushing angle, but also it's coming from a very different position of the hip. And, obviously there's a range within any joint where the strength and the power and speed that you're developing at that range will transfer within kind of a narrow pendulum around that specific position. It sounds like you're advocating for more importance and more of a presence of training at wider angles with the goalies to develop that quickness in the push from more abducted or wider hip positions.
I don't know if it's more importance, but we definitely don't want to ignore it.
Okay.
And I think that variation is good too. Teaching those muscles to work in a variety of angles and positions, I think also reduces a little bit of wear and tear. Makes the muscles or their nervous system a little smarter, but reduces wear and tear a little bit.
And then from the, I think of it like the amplitude of how far the push is. Can you go into a little bit more detail on maybe a couple examples of how you would apply that concept? So, like what would next, if there's an exercise you can describe here that would highlight that, I think that would help. I've seen you do it and we've gone through it together, but the first time that we went through it, I had not seen anybody doing anything like some of the exercises that you suggested. So just for the listener to have a little bit more of a concrete picture of what that might look like.
Yeah. The one that pops into my head right off the hop, and again, it would sort of follow a progression to building strength and then building power. Well, let's say we're trying to work on outer range strength. So overcoming isometrics are like, I don't know that I can't think of a better, way for building strength in that positions, getting against that immovable object, and that you can do it from standing. So getting pushed, in here, we'll do sometimes 3-leg pushes, doing the same from the butterfly, different ranges. And then we can do some, like, with resistance bands, kind of working the same thing, like getting a resistance band attached to the power rack, with getting in that outer range push, coming back. Certainly from the butterfly, same thing. We're working just trying to get with an outer range recovery to push. Those are a few ideas. Does that help?
Those are great. And if you're listening to this, Maria just gave a couple good visual demonstrations that when we get this teed up on YouTube, you'll be able to circle back and watch some of those there. That overcoming isometric idea I like a lot, because you don't need, I always think back to, obviously with Boston, we're very fortunate with the resources that we have. But, I think back to my time working in youth hockey where we had a, 300 square foot party room and 18 kids in there all at once. And, it was some of those isometric ideas. You just need a wall that's not going to move, or a rock that's screwed into the ground, whatever the case is, and you're good to go.
Yeah, it's a go-to at camps, it's perfect.
Earlier when you were talking about some of the goals that you hear from goalies, one thing that was notably absent from that list was getting stronger. And I think that, goalies, obviously every goalie is a little different. I don't mean to stereotype the entire position, but I have heard from that position more than any other, like I don't want to get too strong because I don't want to get bulky. And there's still this kind of pervasive idea that as you get stronger, you lose range of motion, you lose mobility. I think though as part of that, there are some unique considerations with goalies where, they're not engaged in the physical battles that other players are, and the contact element and the injury risk reduction that strength can offer for some of the other skaters is a little different for goalies. So, I'm curious on what's your take on the importance of strength training for goalies, and then, related to that, like at what point are you identifying that this goalie's strong enough and we should really focus more of our efforts, not that you stop strength training, but more of our efforts on other qualities?
Yeah, so it runs the spectrum because you get some goalies too, more like high school, college goalies that they just want to be jacked and they want to lift as heavy as they can lift. And so it's sort of reining them in a little. And then they're the goalies that will tell me, oh, and like, don't worry, I don't lift heavy weights. I use just light weights and high reps, or I just do body weight, or I just do bands. Thank you, Tom Brady. So it's trying to get them, yeah, like understanding that if they're training the right way, they're not going to get overly bulky. They'll be able to keep and improve their mobility, as if they weren't strength training. So that the two go hand in hand. And really, the when I do mobility training with them, it's almost like a specialized type of strength training. So that's kind of the answer to the first part. When are they strong enough? It's a little bit of a judgment call, but when we'll do kind of regular front squats, maybe in the second phase of our off season, and trap bar deadlift, maybe in the second and third phase. But then we go to single leg squat lateral, a little bit more specific patterns. So I'm never trying to, see how much can we get. And I think when I was younger, probably it was like, oh, I got this guy, trap bar deadlifting, like, and you've got all the plates on and the collars are just holding on my little smidgen. But I think just for the wear and tear on the body, that's not worth really for it for any athlete. It's not worth it. So it's like, okay, we've got a good baseline here. Let's get you. How stable are you in producing that strength? How can we challenge that a little bit more? Still using your strength, but add a little more challenge.
Yeah, there's a couple big things there. I think, you had mentioned the specialized mobility is almost a form of strength training. And, I do think that when people hear the word strength, they think of traditional exercises, the squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing, or, dumbbell derivatives of those. And you can get somebody in like a quadruped or hands and knees position and ask them to lift their leg up to the side, and then they're pinned because they don't have the strength in that position to be able to lift their own legs. So, there's certainly some of those positions, are certainly more specific to the needs of the goalie position or the hockey players than others. But, I think being strong in different patterns and different ranges of motion with different starting points, like you mentioned before, kind of that bottoms up idea that caught your attention when you got on the ice as a goalie. All of those things I think could be really important. I want to circle back. You had brought up the lightweight, high rep idea, and I have a few thoughts on that. But what's your feedback to a goalie that has been training with a program or with exercises where they're really focused on lighter weights, higher reps? Obviously you want to encourage the effort, but maybe redirect the intents a little bit. What's your feedback for a goalie that tells you that that's how they're training?
Well, I usually just try to explain to them, what are we training for? What is the outcome we want to feel on the ice? Why do you go to the gym? What do you want to achieve? And usually it's to stop more pucks. Speed is usually an element of that. So then just explaining, okay, because we're not going to tap into your fast twitch fibers doing high reps with a lightweight. We need to go more intense to build that strength to get those motor units firing, to build that reservoir of strength, and then teach you how to apply it very explosively. But then also explain stabilizers, they're the one, they do need stamina. So we're going to stay pretty light with those muscles that are deep to the joint, so we're not going to make those, like, we're not going to try to make those, and like, I know it doesn't really happen, but we're not going to make those restrictive. We're going to stay pretty light and do higher repetitions and teach them to be really, really smart and have the stamina to support your joints. Usually when you explain it that way, it works.
Makes sense. I think there can be some value if, see, depending on the training goal and the athlete and what situation they're in. But when you're lifting light weights for high reps, if you're going or approaching failure, then there can be some changes that some adaptations to that training as far as slow twitch hypertrophy and maybe some low position endurance depending on your method. There's some things that can come out of that can be really beneficial. But I find most of the time when that's how somebody describes their training program, they're not training heavy enough or close enough to failure to get any of those changes. And really what's happening is, they're kind of creating this stimulus that's more or less a glorified warm up, more than anything else. I think the emphasis on, starting back with what are we trying to accomplish in the game and then working back from there certainly makes a lot of sense. But, I think just really understanding too that, like, if you do stuff body weight and you're not fatiguing to a point where you almost feel like you can't go anymore, you're not getting any real significant muscular adaptations or really any conditioning stimulus there. So, but I want to, you and I have talked in the past that at many levels, goalies are almost like the forgotten position. It's pretty rare that practices are designed with the goalie's needs in mind. So, I'm curious, and we'll talk a little bit about, kind of the differences in the conditioning demands between goalies and practices and games in a second. But you've had these opportunities now to work at a lot of camps alongside goalies on the ice, alongside goalie coaches, alongside regular coaches as well. Do you have any advice for coaches on strategies that they can employ within their practices that, may help facilitate or at the very least not get in the way or not hinder the development of their goalies? I obviously without disrupting the flow of the rest of practice, because there's a lot of players that need to be accounted for.
Yeah, and it's tricky for sure. I think a thing that coaches might not appreciate or understand is that practice, and I always come to you and I say, what does the heart rate data look like? And I talk to other coaches that have the access to some of those metrics, because I'm a low tech type. But the energy system that's getting trained in practices isn't the energy system they need to be successful in games. So it's like if I took my Olympic 200, 400 meter champion, and then all our training sessions, other than races, were spent running 1500s, repeat 1500s. Intuitively, anybody can say, well, why would you do that? But it's similar to what happens to goalies in practice. I like the 3 goalie idea. Goalies do not. The last thing they want is to walk in the locker room and see another 3 sets of goalie, like 2 other sets of goalie gear in there. But I think it's a good way to kind of keep the players rolling, but give the goalies that work to rest interval. The other thing too is you look at where shots are taken in practice. It's not where goals are scored in the game. So making it more game-like not having the guys come in and then take a ripper from sort of the middle of the ice in front of the net. Getting them handling the puck more. So a goalie coach that I know, he has the team start a lot of drills with a dump in, so the goalie has to play the puck, and it goes from there. So those are a couple of suggestions, but the energy system is a big one for me. It's like you're training this athlete who's really crucial to the success of your team to do something that isn't what they need in the game.
So let's dive into that a little bit more. I know I've shared an image from our mutual friend Devin McConnell that he had sent me years ago of the heart rate response for one of his goalies in a game and in practice. And I think it was pretty eye-opening just in how substantially different the two visuals were, where obviously it's automatically color coding as the goalie's reaching a certain percentage of their max. And, the visual there was that games look significantly different from practices. So can you talk about, what conditioning in a game looks like for a goalie and how that contrasts to what most goalies go through in practice?
Well, in practice, it's the heart rate goes up and stays up, for extended periods of time. And then when the coaches talk, stop the drill and talk, it comes down and then it goes up and it stays up. And in a game, it's more, peaks and valleys like that, repeat sprinting. So, the energy system should more closely reflect that.
Yeah, I think the two things that I remember from that image in particular were just that there there was almost no recovery window in practice, like you just mentioned, that they were kind of up and staying up, which I think you had mentioned before that it's the goaltending position is a repeat sprint effort, but you don't know how long that's going to be. The team can get kind of hemmed into their own zone, and there might be several minutes where the goalie's working. And some of those extended duration efforts in practice probably prepare the goalie somewhat with the foundational endurance to be able to endure through those situations. But the majority of the time, it's not. It's, there were higher peaks in games, but with lower valleys. So there were much more opportunities to recover.
Yeah. And
I think having both can be really important.
yeah, but I think strategically. So I'm fine with that. Like I call it survival training. And in the off season, I make up these circuits. I call them super PK circuits, and they're just awful. But it's like, okay, nothing's going to be worse than that. And so I think that's fine to add at the end of practice. But we want goalies practicing a skill and being sharp on their skills. And you all know when you're crushed, you're not able to be sharp. I think another thing is that, if you say, well, maybe we should have 3 goalies or give the goalies more rest, it's kind of the practice too hard for the goalie. And it's like, well, no, it's not too hard. It is hard, but it's training them to do a different sport. That's the problem of it. Not that, you're going to hurt the goalie's feelings because practice is too hard.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think my experience is probably similar with yours, that the goalies prefer to get the puck touches too. So, even if maybe it comes at the expense of specificity of conditioning, and then even the quality of execution, sometimes it's they're not certainly not eager to give up the net to take a breather.
They're not, and more than any athlete, and I've trained lots of athletes from different sports, but goalies, some goalies, their goal will be, I want to be the hardest worker. And it's like, why? Like I love hard work and I value it as well, but it's like, what? Like, let's be the best. Let's be the smartest worker. So I think that goes hand in hand too. Like, well, I don't want to look soft and say I'm tired or, switch off too soon. It's like, I want to be the hardest worker on the ice. Okay, well, like, I don't, maybe there's an award for that. But I want to win the game. That's all.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep the goal and not get kind of lost in what you think is the best road to get there. It's really, make sure that the strategies are all in line with helping you be as successful as possible, not necessarily just winning the effort award.
Yeah. And yeah, like, and I'll go and say, I want to work harder than anybody else. Okay, so how are you going to measure that? It's kind of funny.
I think with goalies, with hockey players in general, but certainly with goalies, avoiding hip injuries is often a primary training goal. Can you talk about how you approach building durability with the goalies you work with, and maybe highlight a couple things that you hear from goalies and strategies that they're trying that you correct, or that maybe are well intentioned but a little bit misguided based on your understanding of hip anatomy and the injury pathology?
I think, well, the thing that I think is intuitively they think they should stretch. And so some of them do stretch, and they think they need to stretch for like an hour or 2 hours a day. And I think that sets them up for some failure because they're not building sort of usable strength in those end ranges. They're kind of, so maybe even they're letting the body get into a vulnerable position where they have no control. So I could argue that maybe it increases the risk of injury. So I think it's important to not, and we'll do static stretching. I'm not saying that it has no value, but the goal is always in trying to gain control in those outer ranges, building that mobility. I think another issue when I talk with goalies, and especially some of those goalies we talked about earlier who just want to lift heavy and they want to back squat and deadlift and as heavy as they can, talk about adding wear and tear to the hip joints and how hip impingement is an overuse injury that develops over time. It's a cumulative trauma injury. And so what they'll say is, well, oh, my hips don't hurt. My hips feel fine. So I know your hips feel fine, 18-year-old goalie or 15-year-old goalie, but we want your hips to still be good when you're 22, 23. So I think that's another one. So it's improving the mobility, which is a combination of the stability and flexibility. They're going to get in these awkward positions. You look at that RVH position when their pad is flat and their skate is against the post and they're leaning into it and getting in that close packed position, and you think, oh God, that's awful. That's not good for the hip. But they're going to get in that position. So how can we maximize their control getting into and out of that position? So those are the things. And then, trying to, when they're younger, a little bit, limit reps. So if they've got practice in games and they work with their goalie coach and then they're at this other side, it's like, let's just pick the quality stuff and focus on that and, save some of those reps.
Are there any things that you find that goalies are doing other than static stretching that, either isn't helping or, maybe they're doing some good things, but they're just not doing enough of it? Can you speak to that at all?
I think they're just not making their hips smart enough, and their hips and how their hips work with their torso smart enough. One of the guys that I use with goalies all the time is just single knee balance. So getting in a half kneeling position and lifting up the front foot and then balancing on their knee and getting really good at controlling that balance just using the hip joint and the torso. I think they spend time in their butterfly moving around and they don't really necessarily have the best control of their hip. I like hip cars too, as simple as it is, because when I do those at camps, even with very good goalies, if I do hip cars and I'm there coaching them like in person, I say, bring that knee up in front of you as high as you can. So getting into as much flexion as you can. They'll bring it like their thigh will be about parallel to the floor. And I could say, no, bring it as high as you can. Stays parallel to the floor. And if I bring my hand over and hold my hand at about belly button level in front of them, say, can you touch my hand with your knee? Yeah, boom. So they don't, if you had a baseball pitcher and you said, make as big a circle with your shoulder as you can, and they went to about shoulder height and flattened it off and came back around, you'd be like, what is going on with this? Like, they don't even know what their shoulder does. Goalies don't even know what their hips do.
For somebody that is listening that may not know what cars are, can you spell that out and describe that range of motion of the exercise that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so it's a functional range conditioning technique, and so it stands for controlled articular rotations. And essentially, it's just a technique. So this is the other thing. Goalies tend to get fixated. Like, all I want to do is Eldoa. And that's going to be all my training. It's like, these are just different tools in your toolbox. So functional range conditioning occurs as one. But it's kind of neat because the idea is to really explore all of your available range of motion and to get into those outer range positions and put input into that connective tissue of the joint where there's a lot of sensory receptors. So then your brain starts learning, holy smokes, we can go all, like I can lift my knee as high as my belly button. Wow, who knew that? And so it learns those patterns in the outer ranges that we've talked about a lot today. But then the other thing you can do is generate some intrinsic strength or intrinsic resistance. So the cue I always use is, if we bend our knee as much as we can, flex our knee as much as we can, and we're making as big a circle with our knee, like if we had a pen, taped to our knee, we'd be tracing a big, big circle. But we create tension as if our leg is in a bucket of honey, so we have to push against that and create tension and create strength. That helps our brain learn, hey, wow, you're actually really strong in these positions. So it releases a little bit of that neural governor. Sometimes goalies stretch at home. They say at home, I can do the splits, no problem. But when I get on the ice, I can't. And it's because their brain knows, well, you have no control. So let's not do that. But if we can teach our brain and actually build that strength in the outer ranges, it's like, okay, yeah, this is pretty good. Let's use it.
That idea of building internal tension, honey bucket analogy used, I think is perfect. But it speaks to the importance of going through those exercises with the right intent. Because if you're just swinging your knee around and around in a big circle, you're not really going to get any of the benefit of those exercises. But if you can create a stable pelvic position and then create some of that internal tension, you're activating a lot of the receptors you mentioned, and also starting to build a little bit of strength and a sense of control in some of those outer ranges, which, as you mentioned before, we've talked a lot about today.
Well, and you hit on a really important point that I should have mentioned when we were talking about hip injuries, that anterior, like stable pelvis position. The pelvis is going to move through different, it's not always going to be neutral. But when goalies have that typical anterior pelvic tilt, so kind of sticking their bum out behind them and sort of increasing the arch in their lower back, just like skaters have, it's a common posture. It's not, anything crazy, but for a goalie, especially when they're moving out of the butterfly, that's a big problem because now they don't have that hip flexion. They've lost some of the hip flexion because their pelvis is tilted forward, so they run out of space sooner. So they're recovering that skate to push from the butterfly. They're going to be running into the front of their hip joint, which again is adding wear and tear. Not to say that that's painful, but it's adding wear and tear over time. So trying to teach goalies too to have awareness of neutral pelvis. And so then they want to say, well, when they're on the ice, well, is this my pelvis neutral? And I find it impossible to tell when a goalie's wearing like goalie pants, a chest protector. And that's not where it matters. Where it matters is in your everyday life, trying to retrain your brain that this is my posture, rather than something like, oh, I'm going to be a neutral pelvis now. Well, no, just we want to correct it throughout your day and then just have it become your new normal.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and that playing hockey in pretty much every sport, at some point you're going to be in compromised positions that people who work in the medical professional would not say are ideal for your joint health. And a lot of the battle is just minimizing the unnecessary wear and tear away from the sport. So obviously you want to prepare the athletes to be able to get into and control some of those positions to the best of your ability. But if you think of all of the total volume of stress that we have more control of outside of the actual competition schedule, that can have a major impact on the longevity and durability. And I sometimes use the analogy of the Grand Canyon, that started as a river, and then just slowly over time, obviously over the course of thousands and thousands of years, that now the erosion that has taken place from the forces of the river, and then eventually the wind that's kind of going through that alley has created the Grand Canyon. And that is obviously a very grand scale example, but similar things happen with joint surfaces within the body, that when you start to create more friction in the same areas over and over and over and over, particularly where you're not giving them a reprieve, an opportunity to recover and unload, that you can start to create somewhere that, obviously the longer you can delay that, the more you're going to delay symptoms and prolong careers as players compete through, through the end of their careers and then through the rest of their life, really. Because obviously not everybody plays professionally. I think one of the things that makes hockey great is that there's certainly a great adult league culture around North America too. So, ideally people are staying as healthy as possible so they can enjoy the game for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's the mission. Most goalies, that's the best they'll get out of it.
Cool. Well, Maria, this has been awesome. Where can the listeners connect with you and learn more about what you have going on?
Probably the easiest is Instagram. I'm just at goalie training, and I'm pretty good at answering my DMs eventually. Website is goalietrainingpro.com.
Cool. Thanks, Maria.
You're welcome, Kev. Thanks.